It was supposed to be a weekend escape, a break from the chaos of daily life. 4 friends, Sam, Chris, Lily, and Jenna, decided to spend 2 nights camping deep in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey. Known for its dense forest and eerie legends, the Pine Barrens was a place many avoided after dark, but the group brushed off the warnings, eager for adventure and the thrill of the unknown. The drive to the campsite was filled with laughter and stories. They shared tales of the infamous Jersey Devil, who was said to haunt the woods. Sam, the skeptic of the group, joked that they should leave out some snacks to attract it. "Maybe we'll end up on one of those creepy podcasts," he laughed. They arrived late in the afternoon. The forest was alive with the sounds of nature, chirping birds, rustling leaves, and the occasional snap of twigs underfoot. They set up their tents in a small clearing and started a fire. As dusk settled, the atmosphere shifted. The forest's liveliness faded, replaced by an unsettling silence. Still, the group remained in high spirits, sharing ghost stories and roasting marshmallows. As the fire burned low, Chris suggested they explore a nearby trail before turning in for the night. The path, illuminated only by their flashlights, twisted deeper into the woods. Shadows danced around them, and the trees seemed to close in, creating an oppressive canopy. Lily, who was usually brave, began to feel uneasy. "Guys, maybe we should head back," she said, her voice tinged with nervousness. Sam waved her off. "We're fine. It's just trees and shadows." About 15 minutes into their walk, they stumbled upon an old, dilapidated cabin. The wood was weathered and rotting, the windows shattered, and the door hung crookedly on its hinges. Jenna's curiosity got the better of her. "We have to check this out," she said, already moving toward the cabin. Lily protested. "This feels like the start of a bad horror movie." Chris grinned. "That's the fun part." Reluctantly, Lily followed. Inside, the cabin reeked of mildew and decay. The floor was littered with leaves and animal droppings. In one corner stood an old rocking chair, its cushion torn and stuffing spilling out. The walls were adorned with strange symbols carved into the wood, some of which looked freshly etched. A chill ran down Jenna's spine as she traced one of the carvings with her fingers. "This is so weird," she whispered. Sam, trying to lighten the mood, made a joke about witches and rituals. But as he spoke, they all heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the far side of the cabin. Everyone froze. "Eh? Did you hear that?" Chris asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's probably just the wind," Sam said, though even he sounded unsure. The tapping grew louder, more deliberate. It was coming from outside now, circling the cabin. Jenna's heart raced. "We need to leave. Now." Without waiting for agreement, she bolted out the door, the others close behind. Outside, the forest was darker than they remembered, and the path back to the campsite seemed unfamiliar. They walked quickly, their flashlights casting shaky beams ahead. Every sound, the crunch of leaves, the snap of branches, made them jump. Then they saw it. In the distance, barely illuminated by their lights, stood a figure. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long. Its face was obscured, but they could feel its gaze. It didn't move, just stood there, watching. "What the hell is that?" Lily whispered, her voice trembling. "Let's keep moving," Chris said, trying to stay calm. They picked up their pace, but the figure didn't fade into the distance. Instead, it seemed to follow them, always just far enough away to remain a shadowy silhouette. Panic set in. They started running, the campsite their only goal. The figure's presence seemed to warp the forest around them. Paths they thought they recognized now led nowhere. Trees appeared twisted, their branches clawing at the sky. Lily tripped and fell, scraping her knee. Chris helped her up, but when they turned to check behind them, the figure was gone. "Maybe we lost it," Sam said, though his voice wavered. They finally stumbled into their campsite, breathless and shaken. The fire had burned out, and the clearing felt colder than before. They decided to stay in one tent for safety, huddled together in silence. Hours passed, but none of them could sleep. Every rustle outside made them flinch. At some point, Jenna thought she heard whispering. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it seemed to come from all around them. She nudged Chris. "Do you hear that?" Before he could answer, the tent shook violently. Someone or something was outside. Sam grabbed a flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to shine it out. The light revealed nothing but trees. Still, the shaking continued, more aggressive this time. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became an incomprehensible cacophony. "Stay inside," Chris shouted, his voice breaking. The shaking suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. No one dared to move. Then, a low, guttural laugh echoed through the clearing, chilling them to their core. It was close, right outside the tent. Lily began to cry quietly. "We're not going to make it out of here," she whispered. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first light of dawn broke, the group hesitantly emerged from the tent. The forest looked normal again, as if the night's horrors had been nothing but a bad dream. But the claw marks on the tent and the strange footprints around their campsite told a different story. They packed up in record time and left, vowing never to speak of what had happened. But as they drove away, Jenna glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. Standing at the edge of the forest, barely visible through the trees, was the figure, watching, waiting. To this day, none of them have gone camping again. The memory of that weekend haunts them, a reminder that some places are better left unexplored, and that sometimes the stories meant to scare you around a campfire are more real than you'd ever want to believe. It was a crisp autumn weekend when 5 college friends decided to embark on a camping trip. Emily, Jake, Lauren, Ryan, and Matt were in their junior year and felt the weight of midterms looming. Birchwood Forest, a sprawling and remote woodland a few hours from campus, promised a much-needed escape. Known for its beauty and serene trails, the forest also carried whispers of unsettling local legends. Stories of disappearances and strange sightings had circulated for decades, but the group dismissed them as superstitions. They arrived on a Friday afternoon, spirits high. The car was loaded with tents, food, and a Bluetooth speaker blasting their favorite songs. After a 2-mile hike from the parking area, they found a clearing surrounded by towering pines and set up camp. By sunset, they had a roaring fire and were laughing over poorly cooked hot dogs and marshmallows. As darkness crept in, Lauren suggested they share scary stories. Ryan, always the joker, launched into an exaggerated tale about a ghost that haunted exam halls. They laughed until Emily's turn came. Her story was different. She recounted an old urban legend she'd heard about Birchwood Forest. "They say a hermit used to live here years ago," Emily began, her voice dropping to a hushed tone. "He was obsessed with the idea that the forest was alive, watching him. He started carving strange symbols into the trees, thinking it would protect him. Eventually, he went mad and vanished. Some hikers claim they still see his carvings and hear whispers in the trees." The group chuckled nervously, but Jake rolled his eyes. "Come on, Emily, you can do better than that." Emily smirked. "Fine, why don't we explore and see if the carvings are real?" It was a dare no one wanted to back down from. Grabbing flashlights, they ventured into the woods. The air grew colder as they moved deeper, the firelight fading behind them. The usual forest sounds, crickets, distant owls, seemed to vanish, replaced by an oppressive silence. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, and every rustle made them jump. "Do you see that?" Lauren whispered, pointing to a tree up ahead. The group approached cautiously, their flashlights illuminating what looked like crude carvings etched into the bark. The symbols were strange and angular, their meaning indecipherable. Jake reached out to touch one. "Don't," Emily snapped, "just in case." Jake laughed but pulled his hand back. "It's just some vandalism. Probably kids trying to scare people." "Then why does it look so fresh?" Matt asked, his voice tense. Before anyone could respond, a faint whisper floated through the trees. It was so soft, they almost thought they'd imagined it. Did you hear that?" Lauren asked, clutching Ryan's arm. "Probably the wind," Jake said, though his bravado faltered. But the whisper came again, louder this time. It wasn't the wind. It sounded like words, though none of them could understand what was being said. Panic began to set in. "Let's go back," Emily urged. They turned around, but the path looked different. Trees they swore they'd passed moments ago seemed unfamiliar, their twisted branches forming ominous shapes. Jake took the lead, insisting he knew the way, but after 10 minutes of walking, they were still lost. The whispers followed them, growing louder and more distinct. Occasionally, they sounded like laughter. Then they saw it. Ahead, barely visible in the dim light, was a figure. It stood motionless, its silhouette unnervingly tall and slender. The group froze, their flashlights trembling in their hands. "Who's there?" Ryan called, his voice breaking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, as if observing them. Panic surged through the group, and they ran, stumbling over roots and branches. The whispers seemed to mock them, echoing from every direction. After what felt like an eternity, they burst into their campsite, breathless and terrified. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the clearing. They huddled together, too afraid to sleep. Hours passed, and the forest remained eerily quiet. Just as they began to relax, a low, guttural growl shattered the silence. It came from the edge of the clearing. Flashlights flicked on, scanning the darkness, but they saw nothing. Then the growl came again, closer this time. "Get in the tents," Matt whispered, his face pale. But before they could move, the growl was joined by the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and circling the camp. Shadows danced just beyond the reach of their lights, and for the first time, Jake looked truly afraid. "Whatever it is, it's not an animal," he whispered. Suddenly, one of the tents collapsed, as if something had fallen on it. Lauren screamed, and they all bolted for the trail, abandoning their gear. The forest seemed alive, the trees closing in around them. The whispers turned to screams, overlapping in a cacophony that made it impossible to think. They ran until they reached the parking area, collapsing by the car. Only then did they realize they were missing something or someone. Emily. Emily. Panic set in as they debated whether to go back. Jake insisted they couldn't leave her, but the others were paralyzed by fear. Before they could decide, Emily emerged from the trail, her face pale and eyes wide. "What happened?" Lauren cried, rushing to her. Emily didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was hollow. "I got turned around. I thought I heard you calling me, but when I followed the voice, it wasn't you." "What do you mean?" Matt asked, his stomach sinking. Emily shook her head. "I don't know. It sounded like you, but wrong." They didn't wait to find out more. Piling into the car, they sped away, the forest looming in the rearview mirror. None of them spoke during the drive back to campus. Over the following weeks, they tried to forget, but the nightmares persisted. Emily grew distant, often staring off into space as if listening to something only she could hear. One night, Lauren woke to find Emily standing by the window of their dorm room, whispering to herself. "Emily?" Lauren called softly. Emily turned, her face blank. "It's still watching us," she said before climbing back into bed as if nothing had happened. The group eventually drifted apart, unable to cope with what had happened. But they all knew one thing for certain: some places are meant to be left alone, and Birchwood Forest was one of them. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the rugged terrain of the Cascade Mountains. Friends since college, Emma, Jake, Lily, and Mark were looking forward to their weekend camping trip, far away from their city lives. It was supposed to be a detox from screens, stress, and the noise of urban chaos. Instead, it became a weekend they would never forget, and not for the reasons they'd hoped. The group arrived at the trailhead in the late afternoon, their backpacks stuffed with supplies and spirits high. Jake, the self-appointed leader, had spent weeks researching the perfect spot. It was an isolated clearing near a tranquil lake, reachable only by a 3-hour hike. "This is it, guys, pure wilderness," Jake said, spreading his arms wide. Emma, always the cautious one, scanned the dense forest surrounding them. "Are you sure this place is safe?" she asked, her voice tinged with unease. "Safe. Of course," Jake replied, brushing off her concern. "There's nothing out here but us and nature." The hike was strenuous but rewarding. By the time they reached the clearing, the sun had dipped below the trees, and the sky was painted in hues of orange and pink. They quickly set up their tents, built a small fire, and settled in for their first night under the stars. The sound of the nearby lake lapping gently against the shore was soothing, and the group's laughter echoed through the woods as they shared stories and roasted marshmallows. But as the fire burned low and the night deepened, a strange stillness settled over the forest. The usual symphony of crickets and distant owls was conspicuously absent. Lily noticed it first. "Hey, do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hear what?" Mark asked, poking at the fire with a stick. "Exactly. Nothing." The group fell silent, listening intently. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet, as if holding its breath. Jake dismissed it as just how nature is sometimes, and the group reluctantly retreated to their tents. The next morning, the group awoke to find their campsite untouched, their nerves from the previous night somewhat eased. After breakfast, they decided to explore the area, with Jake leading the way. The lake was serene, its surface reflecting the clear blue sky. But as they wandered deeper into the woods, the atmosphere grew heavier. Trees stood unnaturally close together, their twisted branches forming eerie shapes. The sunlight barely penetrated the dense canopy, casting long shadows on the forest floor. About an hour into their hike, Emma stumbled upon something odd, a crude wooden structure, almost like a makeshift shrine. It was adorned with animal bones, feathers, and other strange trinkets. The centerpiece was a small, carved wooden figure that resembled a humanoid shape with exaggerated limbs. "What the hell is this?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. "Probably some hunter's weird art project," Jake said, though he didn't sound convinced. Mark took a step closer to the shrine, studying the carvings. "These symbols, they look old. Like really old." Let's get out of here," Lily said, her tone urgent. The group reluctantly left the strange structure behind, but an unspoken unease lingered among them. As they made their way back to the campsite, Emma thought she heard faint whispers carried on the wind, but when she turned around, there was nothing there. That evening, the group tried to shake off their unease. They cooked dinner over the fire and played card games, but the eerie silence of the forest persisted. It felt as if the woods were watching them. Around midnight, as they prepared to sleep, a loud crack echoed through the trees. It sounded like a branch snapping, but it was unnervingly close. Jake grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the darkness, revealing nothing but trees. "Probably just an animal," he said, though his hand trembled slightly. The group huddled in their tents, their earlier bravado replaced by a growing sense of dread. The night dragged on, each sound the rustling of leaves, the snap of twigs amplified in the oppressive silence. By morning, the group was visibly shaken but determined to stick it out. However, their resolve began to crumble when they discovered strange markings on the trees surrounding their campsite. The symbols were similar to those they'd seen on the shrine, but were now etched deep into the bark. "Someone's messing with us," Mark said, his voice tight with fear. "Or something," Lily whispered, clutching her jacket. Jake tried to stay calm. "All right, let's pack up and head back. We've had our fun. Time to go." As they packed their gear, Emma noticed something else. Their food supplies had been tampered with. Packages were ripped open, and some of their snacks were missing. "An animal wouldn't do this," she said, holding up a bag with cleanly sliced edges. The group's urgency to leave increased. They quickly dismantled their tents and began the hike back to the trailhead. But the forest seemed different now. The paths they'd taken before felt unfamiliar, and landmarks they'd used to navigate were nowhere to be found. It was as if the forest itself had shifted. By late afternoon, it became clear they were lost. The sun hung low in the sky, and panic began to set in. Jake's confident demeanor had crumbled, and the group bickered about which direction to take. As they argued, Emma froze. "Do you see that?" she whispered, pointing toward the tree line. In the shadows stood a figure, tall and gaunt. It didn't move but seemed to be watching them. The group fell silent, their fear palpable. "It's probably a hiker," Jake said, though his voice wavered. "No hiker stands like that," Mark replied, his eyes wide. The figure disappeared into the trees, but the group's sense of safety was shattered. They walked faster, their breaths shallow and quick. The whispers Emma had heard before now seemed to surround them, growing louder and more insistent. As darkness fell, the group stumbled upon a small clearing and decided to set up camp. They built a fire, hoping it would keep whatever was out there at bay. No one suggested sleeping. The terror of the day had drained them, leaving them jittery and on edge. Around midnight, the whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, and circling the campsite. Jake gripped a hunting knife, his knuckles white. Emma clutched a flashlight, its beam trembling as she scanned the darkness. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream shattered the silence. It was Lily. She pointed toward the trees, where the gaunt figure stood, its face now partially visible. Its features were grotesque, its eyes black voids that seemed to absorb the light. "Run," Jake shouted, and the group bolted into the forest, leaving their supplies behind. The figure didn't chase them, but its presence seemed to loom in every shadow, every twisted tree. After what felt like hours, they stumbled onto a dirt road. Exhausted and terrified, they flagged down a passing truck. The driver, an older man, looked at them with a mix of concern and disbelief. "You kids shouldn't be out here," he said. "This place, it's not safe." He refused to elaborate, but his tone left no doubt that he knew something they didn't. He drove them back to the nearest town, where they collapsed in a cheap motel, too shaken to speak. The group never spoke of the trip again. They avoided each other, unable to face the shared trauma. Emma tried to research the symbols and the shrine, but found nothing definitive. The forest, it seemed, kept its secrets. Years later, Emma received a package, Whispers of the Forgotten Woods. When Amanda suggested a camping trip to the untouched wilderness of Blackthorn Forest, her three friends Lucas, Danielle, and Marcus were hesitant. The forest had a reputation in their small town. Stories of people entering and never returning were whispered in hushed tones at the local diner. But Amanda, an avid adventurer and self-proclaimed skeptic, dismissed them as local folklore meant to keep people from disturbing nature's peace. "Come on, it'll be fun. Plus, it's just a weekend," Amanda insisted, showing them the secluded campsite she'd found online. "We'll be back by Sunday with a load of stories and Instagram-worthy photos." Reluctantly, her friends agreed. The thought of a weekend away from their mundane routines was enticing. By Friday afternoon, the group packed their gear into Lucas's SUV and set off, the excitement of the unknown humming in the air. The drive was uneventful, but as they neared Blackthorn Forest, the mood shifted. The dense canopy of trees loomed overhead, blocking out the sun and casting eerie shadows on the road. Danielle, sitting in the back seat, couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She chalked it up to nerves. They arrived at the campsite just before sunset. It was a small clearing surrounded by towering pines and thick underbrush. The forest was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. Lucas shivered involuntarily. "This place is something else." "Beautiful," Amanda corrected, snapping photos of the clearing. "Come on, let's set up before it gets dark." By the time they finished pitching their tents and lighting a fire, night had fallen. The darkness was oppressive, the forest alive with sounds of nocturnal creatures. They huddled around the fire, laughing and sharing stories to keep the encroaching unease at bay. But as the hours passed, the laughter faded, replaced by a growing tension none of them could explain. "Do you guys hear that?" Danielle asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. The group fell silent. In the distance, faint whispers floated through the trees. They were indistinct, like the murmurs of a far-off crowd, but undeniably there. Lucas frowned. "Probably just the wind." "It doesn't sound like wind," Marcus said, his eyes scanning the dark forest. Amanda shrugged. "It's an old forest. Sound carries weirdly out here. Don't let it freak you out." But it did freak them out. The whispers grew louder as the night wore on, coming from different directions as if circling their campsite. Every so often, the crack of a branch or the crunch of leaves would make them jump. "Maybe this wasn't such a great idea," Danielle admitted, clutching her jacket tightly. Amanda forced a laugh. "It's fine. Let's just get some sleep. Things always seem creepier at night." Reluctantly, they retreated to their tents. But sleep didn't come easily. The whispers persisted, a haunting lullaby that seemed to seep into their very bones. Lucas thought he heard footsteps outside his tent, but dismissed it as paranoia. It wasn't until he felt a cold hand brush against the fabric of his tent that he bolted upright, heart pounding. "Who's there?" he demanded, unzipping the tent. The forest was still, the whispers now eerily absent. He scanned the area with his flashlight but saw nothing. Shaking, he crawled back into his sleeping bag, telling himself it was just a dream. The next morning, the group awoke to find strange symbols etched into the ground around their campsite. They were intricate and unfamiliar, resembling a mix of runes and geometric shapes. Amanda knelt down to inspect them. "These weren't here last night." "No kidding," Marcus said, his voice tight with fear. "Someone's messing with us." "Maybe it's some kind of prank," Amanda suggested, though even she didn't sound convinced. "A prank?" Danielle snapped. "We're in the middle of nowhere, Amanda. Who would do this?" "Let's just pack up and leave," Lucas said. "This place gives me the creeps." Amanda hesitated. She didn't want to admit she was scared, but the unease was impossible to ignore. "Fine, let's go." As they packed, the forest grew unnaturally quiet. The usual sounds of birds and insects were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence. It felt as though the forest itself was watching them. The group started the trek back to their car, sticking close together. The trail that had seemed so clear the day before now felt unfamiliar. Trees appeared twisted, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The whispers returned, louder and more distinct. They seemed to come from the trees themselves, a symphony of voices speaking in a language none of them understood. Danielle clutched Lucas's arm. "We're lost, aren't we?" "No," Amanda said firmly, though her confidence was waning. "We just need to keep moving." Hours passed, and the forest seemed to stretch endlessly. Their water bottles were nearly empty, and exhaustion weighed heavily on them. The whispers grew more menacing, interspersed with low growls that sent shivers down their spines. As night fell, they stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood an ancient tree, its massive trunk covered in the same symbols they'd seen earlier. The air around it felt charged, humming with an energy that made their skin crawl. "We need to keep going," Lucas said, pulling Danielle away from the tree. But Amanda was drawn to it. "Wait, look at this." She pointed to a symbol that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. "It's like it's alive." "Amanda, don't," Marcus warned, but she reached out to touch it. The moment her fingers brushed the bark, the ground trembled. A deafening roar filled the air, and the whispers turned to screams. Shadows emerged from the forest, humanoid figures with hollow eyes and elongated limbs. They moved unnaturally, their jerky movements defying logic. "Run," Lucas shouted, grabbing Amanda's arm. The group sprinted back into the forest, the shadows in pursuit. The terrain seemed to shift beneath their feet, roots and branches rising to trip them. Danielle fell, scraping her hands and knees. Marcus helped her up, but the delay allowed the shadows to close in. One of the creatures reached out, its clawed hand grazing Marcus's shoulder. He screamed as a searing pain shot through him, but he kept running. The group burst through the trees and onto a dirt road. In the distance, they saw the faint glimmer of headlights. "The car," Amanda cried, pushing herself to run faster. They reached the SUV just as the shadows emerged from the forest's edge. Lucas fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. Finally, the engine roared to life and they sped away, the creatures disappearing into the darkness. The drive back to town was silent, each of them processing the nightmare they'd just endured. Marcus winced, clutching his shoulder where the creature had touched him. The skin was blistered and blackened, as if burned. They never spoke of the trip again. Amanda deleted the photos she'd taken, unable to bear the memories they held. But the whispers haunted them, echoing in their minds long after they'd escaped Blackthorn Forest. Weeks later, Danielle woke in the middle of the night to find strange symbols etched into her bedroom wall. She wasn't alone. Each of them began to experience unexplainable events, shadows moving in their peripheral vision, whispers that followed them wherever they went, and the feeling of being watched. Blackthorn Forest had marked them, and its darkness would never let them go.